So the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So in a nutshell, they're just kind of showing you the conditions by which you use them, fight or flight, or rest and digest. So sympathetic, the fight or flight response, like they give the example of running away from a snake, and notice how it's fight or flight, not both. Usually the instinct is for most people is to, cower away from fear, or the reflex is to punch someone in the face, fight. It's a reflex response, and the nerves, basically what you do here. From a physiological standpoint, you increase metabolic strength. You're under remarkable stress. There's only two ways you can increase strength in humans. One is to weight train. You lift the heavy weights, and your muscles hypertrophy, and you get stronger. The other is this, some emergency situation where your child is drowning, you have to save them. Or your kid's stuck under a car, and you have to lift the car. Okay? You're so panicked, and all the catecholamines are flowing through your blood. Gives you the strength to do it, only during that moment. So usually this one, the rest and digest, I say, in my mind, this is the default. This one's always on. Hopefully you go through most days of your life, you don't live like this. Okay? Maybe you get lost in the forest and you have to survive for a week until they find you. This will be on a lot. This one, like you are now, hopefully just rest and digest. That one's the one that's usually on. And these two systems, they kind of counterbalance each other. We spend more time talking about the neurophys, how the nerves are all linked together. Now, autonomic compared to somatic, the differences are shown here. Like I said, you're studying all the nerves that innervate the muscles. So in this figure here, that would be the black line. You have one lower motor neuron that innervates the skeletal muscle. That's what I want you to get from that figure. So let's contrast somatic and autonomic. So this one has the one lower motor neuron. It's one cell that goes to the muscle. Now, before I write anything on the board, look at this. Here's an upper motor neuron. There's one efferent going out, but then there's a synapse and a ganglion, and then a second cell. So here there are two cells that participate in the efferent function to different targets too. It's not skeletal muscle. It's smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, anything but skeletal muscle. It's all the other things that you need to innervate. This is the autonomic nervous system. It's pretty much everything else. So figures that you usually see in this chapter include ones that look like this. I kind of summarize the differences on this remote stop working. Here it goes. The top cell is the somatic nervous system, okay? Nerves that innervate muscle. So, in the somatic nervous system, you have one cell. And we define this cell, the structure, as multipolar. I don't know if you remember that from that previous chapter. We talked about it before, you know, and when we studied the spinal cord, we even talked about where you find these cell bodies. They're in the ventral horn of the gray matter. Okay, now if you have to look that up because you forgot that test, look it up. Just to remind yourself of what you previously had memorized. It comes into play here. So, cell body. It's in the central nervous system, in the ventral horn of the gray matter. Now, part of the cell leaves the central nervous system, right? And it sends a long axon to the muscle, to the target. Also, it's heavily myelinated by the Schwann cell. And you know that when it's stimulated, it releases an action potential, and at the axon terminal, you release in quantal fashion ACH. And it'll stimulate skeletal muscle. So basically, one cell, one neuron goes all the way to the target, and you've got your motor function for that system. Okay, just getting my pins here. All right, so the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the neurophysiology is different. Okay, let's go over this first example. We'll do sympathetic first. I'll put SYM for short. Okay, that one, when you're in the central nervous system, that's where the cell bodies are. So that first cell that leaves is called the preganglionic, because, well, let me just put it up here. So, there's the cell, ganglionic. Because when you synapse out of the protection of the central nervous system, you need a fibrous structure to synapse in for protection, like a little house for synapse outside the central nervous system. So if you're the cell before you synapse, they call that the preganglionic cell or fiber. Now in the sympathetic division, these cells are in the lateral horns. I don't know if you recall that. Let's note that again to remind us of that. The lateral horn of the gray matter. And, well, you know, the spinal cord has many levels. It's a segmented cord. At each level, you give off a pair of spinal nerves, and we went through that. Remember how we named them? Like we named the vertebra, right? Like, remember how there's C8 spinal nerve? Is there C8 vertebra? No, and some of you remember that, so that was that lecture. You know, the sympathetic cells, they're not at every level. It's basically like T1 to L2. At those levels, you have these cells in the lateral horn. T1 to L2. Okay. And they're in the lateral horn. They're the same multipolar cell. This first cell, it leaves, and you know, it's not a very long cell. The axon's not very long. It goes a short distance to a ganglion. And then it synapses on another cell. That's the postganglionic cell. Okay. In this preganglionic cell, it has some myelin, it's lightly myelinated. So I'll draw some myelin on it. And it synapses and it releases the neurotransmitter ACH onto the postganglionic cell. Then the postganglionic cell is stimulated to fire. And that's the cell that will go to the target, whatever it is. In that second cell, the axon is longer, okay, than the first one, usually. In a sympathetic response, you release catecholamines like norepinephrine. That's what the NE stands for. I'll use a different color. So NE is an abbreviation for norepinephrine. I'll just write it out up here in case you wanted to look that up later. In norepinephrine, the targets are different in the autonomic nervous system. It could be smooth muscle. It could be cardiac muscle. Could be glands. That's mostly it. Let me see if they picture anything else there. They show the digestive tract. It helps digest your food. They show the heart. They show some glands there in a nutshell. I'll be more specific about what these targets are later in the lecture. For now, I want you to see the differences. So far, what we see is the somatic nervous system, one cell to the target. Here are two cells. Okay, maybe this cell's, the axon's a little longer to get to the target. Okay. All right, so sympathetic, there's an exception. That's a very important exception. Sometimes there's, at one level, there's sympathetics that don't go to a postganglionic cell, like this one here. You can call this postganglionic. This postganglionic cell goes to the target. Sometimes, you want to stimulate the adrenal gland. So a preganglionic fiber will do that. So instead of a postganglionic cell, you have an adrenal gland. So that's that example right here. The adrenal gland is your ultimate stress response organ. And the inside of it, called the adrenal medulla, has cells that secrete the epi and norepi to help you respond to a very stressful situation. It's really the catecholamines that help you give you that remarkable increase in strength I was talking about. So when I say increase in metabolic strength, it's those catecholamines coursing through your bloodstream. So that's at about the level of around T5. You have a preganglionic cell. And that one is going to send a long preganglionic cell to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla will secrete catecholamines, epi and norepi, into a blood vessel, which blood vessels go everywhere. So this is like E and NE, epinephrine. They help increase the blood pressure, the heart rate. They increase breathing by dilating the bronchioles, things like that. Help you respond to stress. So that is the adrenal medulla. Medulla in anatomy means pith, the inner part. There's an outer cortex, which means bark, but the inside part is the medulla, not the outside part. They secrete different things that help you respond to stress. I'm talking about the E and NE, which come from the adrenal medulla. So I want to Make sure you know the difference there. So any questions on the sympathetic division? I'm going to do the parasympathetic next. So this is our fight or flight response. Catecholamines are what we call E and NE sometimes. That was from a previous lecture, actually. It was a long time ago. It was like one of the first lectures in January. I barely remember saying it, so I'm sure you've forgotten by now. So let's revisit that. Catecholamines, fight or flight response. Okay, parasympathetic. I'll put para SYM for the shorthand of that. You know, the first cell, it's pretty long. The preganglionic axon is much longer than in the sympathetic. So I'll draw the cell here in the central nervous system. Another difference between the two divisions are the anatomical locations of these cells. In the preganglionic cells of the sympathetic division, I said they're at the levels of T1 to L2 in the lateral horn. Not so in the parasympathetic. You only see them in the S234 sacral division. Okay, lateral horn. S2 through S4. And you also see them in 4 cranial nerves. 3, 7, 9, and 10. 4 cranial nerves. So I'm going to put Roman numeral 3, 7, 9, and 10. Because when I teach cranial nerves, we still use those little pesky Roman numerals. And those are the 4 that have parasympathetic function. So those cells would be somewhere in the brainstem. I'll worry about that later. But for now, just understand the neurophysiology, which is the preganglionic, sends a long axon. It's much longer than the parasympathetic division. The ganglion's far away. Okay. It's postganglionic. And the postganglionic, call this pre, call this postganglionic. Just be quick about it. They're both releasing ACH at the ganglion and at the target. So here's ACH, it's releasing ACH on there. This is also releasing ACH. The same kind of targets, okay, but they might have the opposite effect. Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. So to give you an example, you have 2 divisions that kind of counterbalance each other. For example, in a sympathetic response, you help to increase the heart rate to get the blood pumping. What would counterbalance that in a parasympathetic response? What would be the opposite response of that? Well, you only have one choice, right? It's kind of an obvious question. Do you increase it more? No, to counterbalance, you decrease it. I'll give you more examples later. Okay. Let me move on to the next slide. Now there's other terms that are introduced in these chapters. I want to make sure I kind of map it all out for you so you don't get lost in the terms. The first thing is the term cholinergic fiber versus adrenergic. Adrenergic fibers, cholinergic fibers are cells that release ACH. So I'm going to go back to what I drew here, and Put a check mark next to all the ones that are cholinergic. This one released ACH, so that's cholinergic. I put a C for cholinergic. This cell released ACH, that did not. So this preganglionic cell is cholinergic. This one is not. Wait a minute, I think this one is. I didn't draw that in. Let me show you the previous slide. Yeah. I didn't draw it, but this preganglionic cell, all preganglionics are cholinergic. So I'm going to add in ACH, and I'm going to call this cell cholinergic cell. Both of these are cholinergic cells. That's a cholinergic cell, that's a cholinergic cell. And the only ones that release is a cell that releases adrenergic stuff. Epi and norepi are these cells in here, and that's it. Okay, this and this. So I'm gonna put this cell is adrenergic. I'm going to put cells in here are adrenergic.
So the
Yes. Adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine. So I'll put an A next to this cell, A next to that was it. So I just try to introduce all the terms that are used. It's a little confusing even for me. Then the other confusing thing is they like to make you understand the receptors for ACH and NE. There are two types of receptors that bind ACH. Okay. In skeletal muscle, there are nicotinic receptors that bind ACH in the skeletal muscle. For all the parasympathetic targets, the kind of receptor that they use for ACH is muscarinic. Okay, so let's note that. I'm going to erase this now. Okay. All right. All right, so receptors. We talked about the ACH receptor in the neuromuscular junction. Well, one term for it is nicotinic receptor. Nicotine are the substances that can block the receptors, okay? Like from cigarettes. Muscarine is from mushrooms. It's a toxic thing that can block the parasympathetic targets from binding to ACH. So those are two kinds of ACH receptors that I want you to know about. Going back to the adrenergic receptors, they can be alpha or beta. Those are receptors for the epi and the norepi. It used to be The E, which is epinephrine, that used to be called adrenaline. And when I say NE, norepinephrine, that used to be called noradrenaline. But they still use the term adrenergic with the old terms. I kind of don't like it, I didn't switch it. But anyways, there's alpha and beta. I'm not really big on getting into details of the alpha beta receptors. I just want to kind of throw the terminology out there. You're going to come across it when you read the book. Question?
No.
Okay, let's move on. All right, this slide. There's a summary of some of these terms. Trying to get you to understand there's preganglionic and postganglionic. This is sympathetic pathway. They call it a nicotinic receptor, okay, for the binding of ACH here. And there's a muscarinic receptor here that binds ACH. And the adrenergic receptor here, okay, that binds the norepinephrine for the parasympathetic. So it's kind of all summarized here. Just rehearse it a few times, kind of get the terminology down. Drugs are a good example of, well, let me go through the drugs here. I have methylnicol and neostigmine. This binds the muscarinic ACH receptors, so it increases bladder contraction for patients who have difficulty urinating. So let me explain that a little bit. So this binds muscarinic ACH. Okay, so that's a parasympathetic target. On our table here, here's a target for muscarinic parasympathetic, and the drug is affecting the bladder. The bladder is smooth muscle. Okay, you'll learn about the urinary tract in 431. As an example here today, it binds those ACH receptors, okay? So that helps you void the bladder. Voiding the bladder is a parasympathetic function. So physiology side is you're increasing the smooth muscle contraction for that drug. The second example I have is one we talked about before, the drug neostigmine, which inhibits acetylcholinesterase that breaks down ACH. It's used to teach MG, myasthenia gravis. And so in that disease, you have fewer defective ACH receptors. So in that case, ACH is allowed to persist in the synapse to allow the fewer receptors to work better. That's when I taught the neuromuscular junction. So revisit neostigmine in that chapter. That was in lecture exam 3. and that was chapter 9. So I'm trying to get you to bring some of that information forward to the last unit here. In albuterol, more drug. This is the season for that. If you have trouble breathing during allergy season, like I do, and I have an albuterol inhaler, what it does is it dilates the bronchioles. Okay, by binding B2 receptors. That's a sympathetic response. If you don't know, the bronchioles are the small airways that have a lot of smooth muscle. Dilate means open, so that reduces the wheezing so you can breathe easier. Okay, it's another parasympathetic response. Yes, bronchodilation is a sympathetic response. All right, getting away from the function to more physiology and anatomy. This is showing you anatomy and physiology. The anatomy part of it is, I want you to know where the cell bodies are on the central nervous system. The physiology is what they affect. Now I gave you a few examples. Typically we have students memorizing the entire table, but I don't think that's necessary because you're going to take 431, so you'll get most of that. I just hold you responsible for what I talk about in lecture. So again, the anatomy part for the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic division. No, in one word, it's thoracolumbar. Those preganglionic cells are at the levels of T1 to L2. For the parasympathetic division, in a word, it's called cranial sacral. Cranial because there are cells that have parasympathetic function in 4 of 12 cranial nerves, and I already said that was going to be 3, 7, 9, 10. And then sacral because S2 to 4 has parasympathetic function. Okay, so that's kind of where they are. Now in the picture, they use green for sympathetic, these kind of middle levels here, and then purple for parasympathetic, and they show you the cells and what they affect. Now there's a lot of details there, but I did want to show you one histology picture of a ganglion. Ganglion is kind of like a routing station where you make connections. To be specific, it's usually where a preganglionic cell synapses onto a postganglionic cell, although not in all cases, but in most cases. That's generally what you have. And what I point there is the soma, the cell body, and the axons going in and out. Ganglion is where preganglionic cell synapses onto postganglionic cell. It's kind of like, you know, my wife flew home from New York yesterday from a conference, but she had to get onto a connecting flight in Denver. Don't you hate that when it's a connecting flight? You got to get off the plane and get on another one. It's like this one. It takes 2 cells to get somewhere. Okay. What is the somatic? Do you get off the plane? You have 1 cell, and it goes straight to your destination, the skeletal muscle. So the somatic system is like a direct flight, just 1 cell to get here. We need these ganglions for the autonomic nervous system. All right, let's move on. The parasympathetic division, I want to talk about the details of that first, this kind of cranial sacral thing. And there's a lot of nice pictures here. I want to talk more about the function of what they do. So we're going to talk about cells up here and down there, but not in between. That's the other division. So this first is showing you the cranial nerves that have that parasympathetic function. And generally speaking, what they're illustrating here a lot of times they illustrate the central nervous system like this kind of bulbous shape. And the parasympathetic function is up here and down there, cranial, sacral. So they have some nerves there, 3, 7, 9, and 10. And we use the Roman numerals for that. And notice how they kind of have, well, generally speaking, that preganglionic cell, that first cell is a long one. And then there's a ganglion. And then the second one is a short one to the target. Okay, that's basically what they're drawing there. And I'm not going to draw every one, but they have cranial nerve 3. And it's going to the eyeball. What we'll learn when we learn cranial nerve 3, the parasympathetic function is it can constrict pupil. And it helps focus the lens. Well, the fancy word for that is lens accommodation. When I give a lecture on the eye, I'll explain this in great detail. But these are 2 different things. Constrict pupil is like on a sunny day. It kind of it restricts UV light from getting to your retina, which would be bad. So that's good. Constrict the pupil. When you go in a dark room, there's a little light. It would reverse that to let more light in, so you can see in a dark room. Lens accommodation is like for close vision. When you read a book, okay, the accommodation is the lens has to bulge to bend the light rays more so you can see things close to your face. Okay, and as you get older like me, you have to hold it further and further back. The lens doesn't bulge as much. Okay, it gets more stiff as you age, so you need reading glasses to help you. And anyways, there's smooth muscle that allows that lens to kind of bulge. And we'll get into that when we get into the eye. For number 7 there, if you follow it, they kind of send it to the nose and then the eye. Basically, it helps you tears when you cry. That's a parasympathetic function. I'll say it cries. Tear secretion from those glands is a parasympathetic response. For 9, for 7, they have Here, these are all salivary glands. So it also salivates. 7 and 9 both salivate. There's 3 salivary glands you'll learn about when you get to 431. 7 and 9 innervate them all. Okay. All right, so then they have innervation to the heart. That would be 10. That would decrease heart rate. That's the function there. And they have innervation to the lung. Bronchoconstrict. Constrict the airways, not to the point where you're wheezing or asthmatic, but not dilated in a condition of rest. In a condition of rest, your breathing rate should be about 12 to 15 breaths a minute, your respiratory rate. So you only need to be constricted enough to allow that air to flow. You dilate if you want to increase the breathing rate because you're panicked. So those are those cranial nerve functions. The ones down there, S2 to S4, that's the pudendal nerve that I talked about before. So first one, long, the ganglion. Second one, short. They have a picture of, right here, the end of the digestive tract. It helps in the defecation reflex. The reflex is when the distal colon becomes filled with fecal matter. That distension of the wall makes it contract, pushing it towards the anal canal, and that's when you feel the urge to go. It's the defecation reflex. They show a picture of the bladder, okay? Void bladder. That's a parasympathetic response. They have a picture of the female reproductive tract. Okay, well. Uterine contractions reinforced by oxytocin can be a function. I have a picture of the male genitalia. Basically, it's sex arousal in both genders. Okay, so that's parasympathetic function. Any questions on the function? Okay, let's talk about the sympathetic division. That's a little more complicated in terms of the neurophysiology. So let's remember our zones here. You have T1 to L2, and you have other structures here that are going on. So I'll try to draw this out just a little clearer. And you have a lot of targets going from top to bottom here. I want to use this close-up figure to talk about T1 to T4, because there's a difference that happens when you get below T4. But these first top levels of the sympathetic nervous system, you have this chain of ganglion that's right next to the spinal cord. So I have to pay attention to that. I'm going to erase these. So I'm going to draw the first 4 levels. Say T1, I don't know, I'll draw like four of them here. T1 to T4. And those are all preganglionic cells. The thing is, they enter a structure called, there's a chain of ganglion. It's like an elevator. There's like different, you take an elevator, there's different floors. So each of these is a floor, okay? So I'm gonna draw a ganglion here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And they're all connected, these right there. Now the thing is, you can go to the penthouse. There's more ganglion up here, above T1. So you can go all the way up here. And they're all connected. So it's like a chain of ganglion. In fact, they call this the sympathetic chain ganglia. This structure right here. Write that down. All right, so what they're showing you here is you can enter the chain and you can synapse onto a cell at the same level. And the postganglionic can go to the target. So let me kind of redraw these entering the cell and then synapsing, and then a postganglionic goes to the target. So in my first example here, I drew a cell at T4 going into the chain, then synapsing, then going to the target at the same level, T4. Okay. However, that's not always the case. Like for example, if you wanted to go up here to the eye, that's your target. T1 is at your sternum. So if you want to send a nerve to the eye, let's say this top one here, it has to enter the cell. It will not synapse. It has to ascend up this chain of ganglion, then synapse, then go to the eye. Okay. I think that makes intuitive sense because your eye's up here and the cell is like here somewhere. You could go down the elevator too. You don't have to go up. The point is, you're at T1 and you don't synapse at that level. You ascend. Okay. So any questions of what I did? I gave you 2 possible examples of what usually happens for the neurophysiology. One example, you enter the chain, you synapse at the same level. So you got pre. What is this cell? Pre or post? This is post. What is this cell? Pre or post? This one's post. So if you're with me here, what is this cell? The one that entered and went up. That's pre. Okay. To give you some examples here, sympathetic function in the eye. The pupils dilate. Okay. There's one autonomic lab. I don't do it here, but the 2 lab partners. One tries to scare the other lab partner by stroking the nape of the neck unexpectedly, and that's supposed to scare them. You're staring right in each other's eyes, and it's supposed to dilate. Okay. Dilation is a sympathetic response of the pupils. In terms of skin, the sympathetic function is you increase sweating there. I don't know whether they have the sweat salivary gland there. You don't salivate. Let's see, increase sweating. And the heart rate increases, and the lungs the bronchos dilate. So I'm going to write increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, because you are doing what's called bronchodilation. You're opening up the small airways, making it easier to breathe, basically. So that's what you have there in terms of the function. I think this stuff is kind of the confusing thing, how the nerves track through the system there. Now, this is a chain of ganglion. A term that your book uses, they call an individual ganglion at a certain level a paravertebral ganglion. Notice the spelling. Ganglia, ends with the A, is plural. Ganglion is singular. Okay, and they call it paravertebral because you have two of these chains on either side of the central nervous system. I only drew one, like they did in the example there. That's another term. You know, we've seen this before. When I gave the sympathetic, when I gave the spinal cord lecture, I called it a sympathetic ganglion. Okay, here it's called paravertebral. I'm going to move on. This is still the sympathetic, okay? But it's showing you from the level of T5 on down. And it's different. There's different things down here in the abdominal region, okay? When you get to the level of T5 or below, there's other things that can happen. So just to distinguish, okay, here's T5. What can happen is a preganglionic cell, it can enter the chain and it doesn't synapse and it just goes right through. That's what's being shown to you, like right here. There are cells that go right through to another ganglion. So you go through the first ganglion and you synapse in these other ganglions. So in what I drew here, this cell at the level of T5, you tell me, is it pre or post? I'm pointing. It is pre. I heard both. Let's make sure we're not confused. It enters the chain. Does it synapse? Yes or no?
No.
The answer is no. It continues on, so it's the same cell. It's preganglionic. After it synapses, it becomes post. Okay? So this is pre, making this cell pre or post? Post. That's the postganglionic cell there. So you have a second ganglion here. Okay, and they give you three examples, which are the main examples of these ganglion. The celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. Those actually have the same names of the blood vessels that they're associated with that you will learn in 431. So let's write those names down. It's worth noting.
So anything after T5?
Yeah, pretty much T5 or below, it can do this. Go through and go to one of these three ganglion. Collectively, they're called prevertebral ganglion, or collateral ganglion. Giving you all the terms that you're going to possibly see. And they are either going to be celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric, ganglion, or inferior. Ganglion. So let's recap all the ganglia. The daunting thing for this is just getting the names straight. You have the preganglionic fibers here from the sympathetic division. They enter that chain. The chain is the sympathetic chain ganglion. But we call one of those in the chain, a link of the chain, a paravertebral ganglion, because they flank the vertebral column. If you want to see that, look at the baby back ribs model later in the lab. Okay. Before I call them sympathetic ganglion, same thing. They can enter the chain and synapse at the same level, pre, post. They can enter the chain, they can ascend or descend, go up the elevator or down the elevator. Okay, doesn't matter. The example I gave, they ascend. Another example is the preganglionic enters the chain, doesn't synapse, goes through the chain, and synapses later at a prevertebral ganglion. They're called pre because pre means before. These are in front of the vertebral column, literally. They're on the abdominal aorta, which is in front, literally laying right on top of the vertebral column. I know it doesn't make sense the way I drew it. I can't draw in front. Anyways, as a category, they're called prevertebral or collateral ganglion, but it's specifically one of these three. Okay, they're located outside of the central nervous system. The last example I want to give that you got to know has to do with the adrenal medulla, and it's right here. Okay. Now, I don't know if you could tell, but they draw the pre-post differently. They use the same color green, but notice how the pre is a darker green, and the post is a faded out green. Look at the adrenal medulla. Is that dark green or faded out green, if you can see it? It's a darker green. That's a preganglionic fiber. So that's different from all the rest that I've taught you. So here's what happens for the adrenal medulla. I'll just draw another one here. For the adrenal medulla, the cell sends an axon to the paravertebral ganglion. It does not synapse. It goes right through. That preganglionic fiber goes to a prevertebral ganglion. It does not synapse. It goes right through to the adrenal medulla, or then finally synapses and it stimulates that gland. So that's the one exception where you go through both ganglion, you never synapse, and you're a preganglionic fiber all the way to the adrenal medulla. So you're pre here, you're preganglionic here, and then you synapse here. Adrenal medulla. Okay, we'll review some of these pathways when we come back from break. When we come back from break today, again, we're going to do course eval, so be back by 8:40 sharp. We'll see you then.